Great Uncle Horace. As I stepped off the bus and onto the gravelled pathway, my eyes fell upon the tall, creaky building that was once the epitome of grandeur. A run-down mansion, it stood alone amidst the wilderness, hidden from the world by the towering oak trees and a blanket of relentless fog. Even in daylight, this place was dark, as if it was caught in a perpetual state of dusk. My feet crunched on the autumn leaves as I approached the gate, rusted hinges squealing in protest. The imposing structure, scarred by time and neglect, towered above me, but within its derelict walls and peeling paint, a time capsule of memories lay buried. The story goes that my great-uncle Horace was the last person to inhabit this mansion. A recluse, he was an avid collector of peculiar artifacts, some said even of the supernatural kind. No one knew much about him, as he had severed ties with the family decades ago. Our only connection was a bunch of faded pictures and cryptic stories passed down through generations. With my parents' sudden passing, I found myself the unlikely heir to Uncle Horace's estate. I hadn't stepped foot in this mansion for over 20 years, but today the house beckoned me into its labyrinth of shadows. As I pushed open the heavy wooden doors, a gust of stale air rushed out, carrying the scent of dust and decay. A chill ran down my spine as the mansion welcomed me with its eerie silence, broken only by the distant echo of the grandfather clock in the great hall. The hallway was cloaked in darkness, but my memories served as a guiding light. I stumbled into the grand library, my favorite room as a kid. Dust-laden books stood like silent guards, their once vibrant colors lost to time. The fireplace was cold, its charred remains a stark reminder of the warmth it once provided. Remembering Uncle Horace's ritual, I reached for a candle and struck a match, the flames flicker casting dancing shadows on the walls. I felt an odd comfort as the warm glow filled the room. Suddenly, a chilling breeze swept across the room, extinguishing the candle. The match slipped from my trembling fingers. A low rumble, a sound like a distant storm, echoed throughout the mansion. My heart pounded as I realized the mansion wasn't as deserted as it seemed. Footsteps above me, slow, deliberate, snapped me back to reality. They were getting closer. It was impossible. No one lived here for years, or so I thought. I called out, "Who's there?" But my words bounced back, swallowed by the menacing silence. The chilling wind picked up again, whispering secrets in a language long forgotten. The mansion creaked, its wooden bones rattling in protest. It was as if the house itself was alive, each room breathing, watching, waiting. I pressed my back against a bookcase, my mind whirring with questions. Who was here? Was this Uncle Horace's doing? Was I walking in a trap, lured by the prospect of a forgotten inheritance? Suddenly, the house went silent. Even the whispering wind held its breath. I could hear my heartbeat, each thump echoing in the silence. I looked around in the dim light, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was lurking in the shadows. Then I heard it. A soft, raspy voice calling out my name from the darkness above. I froze. It was a voice I recognized, but it was impossible. It couldn't be. "Felix," it called again. It was Uncle Horace's voice, but Uncle Horace was dead, wasn't he? Fear pulsed through me. My mind screamed to run, but my curiosity rooted me in place. A mix of fear, intrigue, and a sense of responsibility towards this cursed legacy kept me from fleeing. The mansion held a secret, and I was determined to uncover it. I climbed the stairs, each step amplifying the tension. The upper floor was darker, the air colder. I reached for a door, the door to Uncle Horace's room. With a deep breath, I pushed it open, stepping into the unknown, stepping into a tale that was yet to unfold. My heart pounded as the voice echoed once more, this time from within the room. The room was enshrined in darkness, the only light coming from a sliver of the moon peeking through the heavy curtains. Everything was untouched, preserved just like he had left it. I felt a chill wind graze my neck, and I whirled around but saw nothing. I stepped forward, my feet sinking into the plush carpet, my eyes straining to see through the darkness. The only sound was the creaking floorboards beneath me and my heartbeat thundering in my ears. Suddenly, the room was filled with the soft, rhythmic ticking of a clock. A strange feeling washed over me as I turned towards the sound. On a mahogany table sat a golden clock. I picked it up, its surface cold to touch, its hands moving in a relentless march towards time. I remembered this clock. It was a priceless heirloom said to possess mystical powers. Uncle Horace claimed it was a bridge between realms, but I dismissed it as just another one of his eccentric stories, until now. The ticking grew louder, each tick echoing like a heartbeat. The air grew colder, and I felt an unseen presence looming over me. I looked up, and my blood ran cold. In the corner of the room, I saw a figure, a silhouette, wavering in the moonlight. It was tall and thin, draped in a cloak, its face hidden in the shadows. Its posture was eerily familiar. The figure stepped forward into the dim light, and I felt my breath hitch. The face that emerged from the shadows was one I had seen only in faded pictures. Uncle Horace. His eyes were hollow, his skin ashen, and his expression a terrifying calm. He looked at me, his gaze piercing through the darkness. "Felix," he whispered, "you've finally come." I took a step back, unable to comprehend what was happening. You're dead," I stammered, my voice echoing in the silent room. My mind raced, searching for a logical explanation. Uncle Horace chuckled, a bone-chilling sound that echoed throughout the room. "Death is merely a transition, Felix. I've waited for you." Suddenly, a gust of wind blew open the curtains, and the room was bathed in a cold, moonlit glow. The figure of Uncle Horace flickered before dissipating into a smoky haze. The golden clock fell from my trembling hands, its ticking abruptly stopping as it hit the floor. The room was silent once more. The spectral presence vanished, but the air remained heavy, and the echo of Uncle Horace's voice seemed to linger. I was alone again, standing in the heart of a haunted mansion with the echo of my undead uncle's voice chilling my soul. My mission was clear now. I had to uncover the secrets that lay buried within these walls. The clock, the mansion, Uncle Horace, everything was interconnected, and it was up to me to solve this macabre puzzle. As the moon cast long, twisted shadows across the room, I knew my journey had just begun. It was going to be a long, frightening night. A night filled with secrets and apparitions, a night where reality intertwined with the supernatural, a night in the mansion of my great-uncle Horace. The echoes of Uncle Henry's house. As a young man, I was adventurous, always seeking thrill and mystery. One day, in the heart of summer, I found myself driving to the small, isolated town where my Uncle Henry used to live. The man had been a recluse and rarely interacted with our family. Still, he'd passed away a few months back, and I had been called upon to clean up his old farmhouse. Uncle Henry's farmhouse was nestled among acres of untamed land. Approaching it felt like driving into the mouth of an untamed beast, the overgrown grass its gnashing teeth. The wooden exterior of the house was charred black with age, paint flaking off in sheets, giving it a gruesome appeal. As I stepped out of the car, the silence of the place hit me. I could only hear the rustling of dried leaves and the occasional eerie creak of the swinging porch sign in the wind. The old wooden gate groaned in protest as I pushed it open. Walking up the stone path, I could feel an overwhelming sense of unease creeping in, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Once I entered the house, the stale, musty smell of decay hit me, a shiver running down my spine. I could hear the sound of my own heart beating in the oppressive silence, and the rhythmic ticking of an old clock somewhere inside the house only heightened the sense of dread. Uncle Henry was a collector, I knew. His passion had been antiques, strange artifacts and oddities that he'd picked up from auctions and estate sales. A single faded picture of my uncle, standing with a tall, gaunt stranger, was the only thing of personal value that he'd kept. Inside the farmhouse, it was like walking into a bizarre museum. The walls adorned with disturbing paintings, artifacts of indeterminate origin, and shelves of books filled with cryptic symbols. A shroud of darkness seemed to hang heavy on the rooms. I made my way to Uncle Henry's study, the room I'd heard stories about. An old-fashioned oil lamp sat on the desk, and beside it, a journal bound in leather. I lit the lamp, opened the journal, and started to read. Uncle Henry's writing was a maze of bizarre experiences, eerie encounters, and dark rituals. My eyes widened as I read his encounters with spirits and otherworldly entities. I was skeptical, of course, assuming he was a victim of his own fascination with the supernatural. Suddenly, a deafening thud echoed through the house. I jumped, nearly knocking over the oil lamp. As I hurried to steady it, I heard a bone-chilling whisper. "You shouldn't have come." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The whisper was so close, as if it had come from right behind me. I turned around slowly, half expecting to see someone standing there. The room was empty. Brushing it off as a product of my imagination, I decided to resume reading the journal. But as I delved deeper into Uncle Henry's accounts, the details became darker, filled with cryptic references to unspeakable pacts and boundaries crossed. A feeling of unease started to gnaw at me, but I was too absorbed in the entries to pay it much heed. Until I came across an entry dated the day before Uncle Henry's death. The words seemed to be hastily scribbled, and there was a sense of fear, urgency in the writing that sent chills down my spine. "Tomorrow is the day," the entry began. "The price of my foolish curiosity will be due. If anyone is reading this, leave now. The house isn't safe." Just as I finished reading the entry, I heard a strange scratching sound. It was faint at first, but steadily grew louder. It was coming from the basement. My heart was racing now, and every fiber of my being was telling me to leave. But curiosity, or perhaps the need to know the truth, overpowered my fear. Armed with the oil lamp, I descended into the basement. The basement was a chilling sight. Cobwebs hung in every corner, with dust particles dancing in the faint glow of the oil lamp. At the far end of the room was a large wooden chest, its surface etched with strange symbols. The scratching sound was emanating from it. As I approached the chest, the temperature seemed to drop sharply. I could see my breath in the cold, stagnant air. I reached out to open the lid, the scratching growing louder and more frantic. With a deep breath, I flung open the lid. Inside was a mirror, its silver surface gleaming under the dim light. But something wasn't right. My reflection wasn't looking back at me. Instead, it seemed to be trapped in the mirror, frantically scratching at the glass, mouthing a silent scream. And then the whisper came again, louder this time, echoing around the room. "You shouldn't have come." That was the last thing I remembered before everything went black. The Unseen Pact. The narrow road I found myself on, heading towards the old, dilapidated structure, was filled with the sounds of a distant hooting owl and rustling leaves. The house, tucked in the corner of a dimly lit street, seemed untouched for decades, draped in an almost tangible layer of melancholy. From my driver's seat, I looked at its narrow facade with a sense of unease. It stood 2-story high, a stark contrast to the lively neighborhood, with its walls adorned with graffiti and overgrown ivy climbing up its weathered brick exterior. Just by looking at it, one could feel a profound sense of isolation and decay. Dark curtains masked every window, hiding any signs of life. The yard was overrun with weeds, seemingly the only living things around the house. But there was something peculiar about this place. Despite its dilapidated state, it still held a certain charm for me, probably because of the memories associated with it. My childhood was filled with stories about Uncle Jasper's house, a man who, despite being family, was always enshrouded in a veil of mystery. As a kid, I used to visit his house regularly, enjoying his unusual stories and homemade cookies. Then suddenly, without any explanation, the visit stopped. The Unseen Pact. The narrow road I found myself on, heading towards the old, dilapidated structure, was filled with the sounds of a distant hooting owl and rustling leaves. The house, tucked in the corner of a dimly lit street, seemed untouched for decades, draped in an almost tangible layer of melancholy. From my driver's seat, I looked at its narrow facade with a sense of unease. It stood 2-story high, a stark contrast to the lively neighborhood, with its walls adorned with graffiti and overgrown ivy climbing up its weathered brick exterior. Just by looking at it, one could feel a profound sense of isolation and decay. Dark curtains masked every window, hiding any signs of life. The yard was overrun with weeds, seemingly the only living things around the house. But there was something peculiar about this place. Despite its dilapidated state, it still held a certain charm for me, probably because of the memories associated with it. My childhood was filled with stories about Uncle Jasper's house, a man who, despite being family, was always enshrouded in a veil of mystery. As a kid, I used to visit his house regularly, enjoying his unusual stories and homemade cookies. Then suddenly, without any explanation, the visit stopped. Now, decades later, there I was, drawn back to this ghostly place by the last remaining ties of kinship. I got out of the car, the gravel crunching under my shoes, echoing eerily in the silent night. As I pushed open the rusty gate, its squeaky protestation reverberated in the empty street. Taking a deep breath, I proceeded to tread the broken walkway leading up to the door, shrouded in shadows. Knocking tentatively, I half expected no answer, but then a gruff voice called out, "Enter!" With a strange mix of anticipation and trepidation, I turned the brass knob. My knowledge of my uncle was limited to childhood memories of an eccentric man with a loud laugh and deep-set, twinkling eyes. But after all these years, I had no idea what kind of person he had turned into. The visit stopped without any plausible reason. My parents were vague when I asked about Uncle Jasper, avoiding the topic with a discomfort that made me even more curious. I learned that something had happened, a rift of sorts. Yet the cause was left undisclosed, leaving me with more questions than answers. After Jasper's name surfaced during a recent family gathering, I felt a strange urge to reconnect with him. His isolation didn't sit well with me, and my attempts to learn more were met with discomfort or outright refusal from other family members. That's when I decided to visit him. As I stepped into the house, a musty smell of damp wood and old books filled my nostrils. The ticking of a long-case clock echoed through the dimly lit corridor. I felt a chill run down my spine, but the voice called out again, its tone aged and weary, "Come in." Upon entering, I was struck by the uncanny familiarity of the room despite its unkept state. And there in a corner sat Uncle Jasper, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. His hair, once jet black, now a thinning shade of white, falling haphazardly onto his drooping shoulders. The man, who once bustled with energy, sat lifelessly, his back hunched and hands resting on the armrest. Summoning courage, I called out, "Uncle Jasper, it's me." "Max," he completed my sentence, his voice barely a whisper, his face turned towards me, albeit sluggishly. "Yes, it's good to see you again, Uncle," I managed to say, although his milky white eyes, indicating blindness, sent a shiver down my spine. Why did no one tell me about this? I thought. How could they leave him alone here? Uncle Jasper motioned towards an old armchair opposite him with a hand that seemed stiff and gnarled from age. I sat down, wincing slightly at the dust that arose from the ancient upholstery. Trying to ignore the discomfort, I focused my attention on the elderly figure in front of me. "I remember our times together when I was a child," I started, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I always wondered why we lost touch." A slight smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Your parents didn't approve of some decisions I made," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the rhythmic ticking of the clock. Intrigue filled my thoughts. What decisions could have possibly caused this deep-seated rift in the family? I wanted to know, but seeing him in his frail state, I hesitated. "Do you have someone to look after you, Uncle?" I asked instead, trying to steer away from the topic that was evidently painful for both of us. Uncle Jasper's face hardened, his pale eyes staring blankly towards the window. He seemed lost in thought for a moment. "It was a different era," he began in a whisper, not addressing my question. "An era when you took a chance without understanding the consequences fully." His cryptic statement left me more puzzled. However, I decided to proceed with my proposal. "Uncle Jasper, I would like to visit you, maybe help around a bit," I offered, knowing full well that he needed more than just company. "Max," he repeated, as if trying to recollect, "you should do as your family did. Stay away from those who have gambled with their essence." His words felt like a cold shower, sending chills down my spine, but I couldn't just abandon him. "I work nearby. I can drop by after work and help out." Suddenly, a hollow laugh echoed through the room, causing me to jump. Uncle Jasper, who had been relatively motionless, stood up slowly. His movement was labored, as though each joint protested his actions. As he rose, something fell from the folds of his clothes, squirming on the floor. I stared at the writhing forms, realization striking me like a punch. They were worms, a grotesque sight that made my stomach churn. Uncle Jasper turned to face me, his milky eyes seeming to look straight into mine. The realization that he could see, despite his apparent blindness, was unsettling. "Leave, Max. You would do better to spend your time with those still entirely of this world," he said, his voice grating in the eerie silence. Despite the nausea that rose within me at the sight of worms, I stayed rooted to the spot, shock mingling with a deep-seated sense of compassion for Uncle Jasper. This was no environment for an elderly man to live in, and certainly not alone. But there was more to it. His cryptic words, the tangible sense of dread, it all suggested a mystery that both scared and fascinated me. Seeing my hesitation, Uncle Jasper moved closer, dragging his feet in an eerie shuffle that echoed ominously through the room. His stark white eyes bored into me, sending icy tendrils of fear crawling up my spine. But I couldn't tear myself away from his gaze, nor could I shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. "You don't understand, Max," he rasped, his voice filled with an urgency that jolted me. "This is no place for the living." What do you mean, Uncle?" I stammered, my pulse quickening with each passing second. A slow, chilling grin spread across his face, sending fresh waves of unease washing over me. Decades ago, I delved into realms no man should. I meddled with the unseen, tampered with the threads of life and death, and now I pay the price. His confession echoed through the room, his words heavy with a regret that was almost palpable. I sat frozen in the old armchair, trying to comprehend the enormity of what he had just revealed. My heart pounded in my chest as a deep-seated terror crept over me, the frail, aged man in front of me taking on an entirely new, horrifying aspect. The air grew colder, the eerie silence now punctuated by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock. The decrepit room seemed to close in on me, the once familiar house suddenly alien and threatening. "Leave," Uncle Jasper whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding in my ears. "Leave and don't look back. This house, this life, it's no longer mine." As the finality of his words sank in, I stood up, stumbling towards the door. I glanced back once, my eyes meeting his one last time. There was a desperate plea in them, a plea for me to heed his warning, to escape while I still could. The trip back to my car was a blur, the chilling encounter leaving me shaken to my core. As I pulled away from the curbside, I looked back at the crumbling house, its haunting silhouette etched against the dusky sky. A sense of dread gripped me as I realized the horrifying truth. Uncle Jasper was living in a nightmare of his own making, and there was nothing I could do to save him.